Hi, this is the Mark Little Show. I am Mark Little. I'm your host. I'm a pastor, I'm a lawyer, and I am a political commentator. Now, just picture this. You're sitting in church, which I do every Sunday, surrounded by your family, maybe your children, maybe even your elderly parents. The service is underway. Boy, we're in praise and worship. When suddenly the doors burst open. Protesters flood the sanctuary, shouting, chanting, disrupting the worship service. Women, they grab their children. The elderly look around in confusion and fear. The sanctity of the moment is shattered. This isn't a hypothetical. This happened in Minneapolis, Minnesota, where activists stormed a church to protest ICE, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Now, among those present, the failed former CNN anchor who appears every New Year's Eve drunk on camera, Don Lemon. He was there in what he'd call a journalistic endeavor. Now, here's what makes this particularly rich with irony. For years, these same activists have demanded aggressive prosecution of pro-life advocates under something called the Freedom of Access to Clinic Entrances Act. The acronym is FACE, the FACE Act, for blocking access to abortion facilities or creating intimidating environments. Yes, that's what they use to hit old women over the head who are against abortion. That's what they use. Put them in jail, too. They've celebrated every conviction, and they've demanded maximum sentences. Get this. Maximum sentences. That's what they wanted. But when they storm a church, a place of worship, explicitly protected under that same FACE Act statute, they act shocked. Oh, my word, clutch the pearls that anyone would suggest that they've broken the law. We're going to examine what the FACE Act actually says, how it's been enforced against pro-life advocates, and why these protesters apparently believed they had a right to do to a church what they've spent years saying no one should do to an abortion clinic. This is why this is called the Mark Little Show of Faith, Law, and Politics. We do it all here. Now, I want you to help me make this make sense to me. I got to figure it out. Maybe you'll help me along. Stay with me. We'll be right back. This is the Mark Little Show. Welcome back. This is Mark Little. I am Mark Little. I'm your host. This is Faith, Law, and Politics at Play today. I got to tell you, I've never been so shocked than to see people barnstorm a church. Many of you know I ran a large church in Southern California. And all I can say is Don Lemon and these people knew what church to go to. This would have never happened in Inglewood, California. That's all I'll say. I'll leave it right there. You can read between the lines. Now let's start with what the law, the FACE Act, actually says. The Freedom of Access to Clinic Entrances Act was passed in 1994. Most people think it only protects abortion clinics. Newsflash, that's not accurate. Now here's the relevant language. And the law citation is 18 USC, stands for United States Code, 18 USC, Section 248. And it says, the act makes it a federal crime to use force, threat of force, or physical obstruction to intentionally injure, intimidate, or interfere with any person who is obtaining or providing reproductive health services. Now, I got a problem with that definition because it's not reproductive at all, but that's what it says. And this is the part of the law that everyone is familiar with. That's what they quote. That's what Don Lemon would quote. That's what Attorney General Ellison would quote. It's a wonder that he used to be a congressman, that he used to be in the Congress. This man is all on TV, misquoting the law. Bless his heart, as they would say in Texas. Here's what gets overlooked, Mr. Ellison. The same section makes it equally illegal to intentionally damage or destroy the property of a facility providing reproductive health services, here it is, or a place of religious worship. Drop the mic. And it prohibits using force, threat of force, or physical obstruction to intentionally injure, intimidate, or interfere with any person lawfully exercising or seeking to exercise the First Amendment right of, here it is, religious freedom at a place of religious worship. Newsflash, Attorney General Ellison, you might need to go back to law school. Read that again. The statute explicitly protects places of religious worship and the people trying to worship there. It's not just about abortion clinics, and it never was. The penalty structure is serious. Up to 1 year in prison for a first offense, up to 3 years for subsequent offenses. I wonder what they give if you're just ignorant. But that's another podcast. And if bodily injury occurs, up to 10 years. If death results, the perpetrator or perpetrators faces up to life in prison. Congress included houses of worship in this statute because they recognized a fundamental principle. Americans have the right to assemble for worship without fear of intimidation or disruption. That right is protected by both the First Amendment and this federal statute. And in most states, the First Amendment is the same at the state level as well. It mirrors the federal Constitution as relates to various, if not most, amendments. So when activists storm a church service, creating fear and disrupting service, they're not just being rude. By all accounts, they're violating the very federal law they've demanded be used against those who oppose abortion at abortion clinics in particular. All right? Now, let's look at how this law has actually been enforced. Because these protesters, these activists, I'm not so sure they're protesters anymore. It seems like they're more activists to me, but somebody else can chime in on that. But these folks know exactly how it works. They've been cheering it on. Yeah. So let's look at how this has actually been enforced, since they're so gung-ho about it. Now, in March 2023, let me call the roll on what they would consider their victories. The Department of Justice, not under the current administration, but the Department of Justice in 2023, secured the convictions against 11 pro-life activists in Tennessee who blocked the entrance to an abortion clinic in Mount Juliet. They were charged under the FACE Act with conspiracy against rights and violating the act itself. Several received prison sentences ranging from 6 months to nearly 2 years. Later in that year, 2023, in August, 5 pro-life protesters in Michigan were convicted under the FACE Act for blocking access to a reproductive health clinic in Saginaw. The evidence showed they used their vehicles and bodies to prevent patients and staff from entering. And they faced up to 18 months in federal prison. In October 2023, the magical year, 2 protesters in Florida were sentenced under the FACE Act for blocking the entrance to an abortion facility in Fort Lauderdale. One received 21 months in federal prison. The other received 27 months. And just last year, a woman in Pennsylvania was sentenced to 12 months and 1 day in federal prison for violating the FACE Act by blocking access to a Philadelphia clinic. And without going deep, one of the women in one of these cases is someone that I know personally. So yes, I've seen the FACE Act in real time. These cases share common elements. Protesters physically blocked access to facilities. They created intimidating environments. They interfered with people seeking services. And then the activists celebrated every single prosecution. They demanded these convictions. They argued that no one has the right to interfere with someone else exercising their constitutional rights, no matter how strongly they disagree. And I'm sure someone along the line said, no one is above the law. We've heard that a time or two. That was the standard that they set, wasn't it? That was the principle they championed. You see where I'm going. Access to facilities must be protected. Intimidating environments cannot be tolerated. Disruption of constitutional rights, it must be prosecuted. Am I right about it? So here's my question. Did they not read the statute they were celebrating? Did they somehow miss that the exact same law protects churches? Or did they simply assume that the law would never be applied to them? Because, well, they're on the right side of politics, they would say. And in some cases, they would say they were on the right side of history. Oh, I just love it when I hear that. The breathtaking audacity is hard to fathom. You spend years demanding maximum prosecution for people who block abortion clinic doors. And then you storm a church sanctuary. And then you act surprised when someone points out that you violated the same federal law. Make it make sense. Now, let's examine what occurred in Minneapolis. And then let's apply the exact same legal standard these brilliant activists demanded be used against pro-life protesters. Yeah, let's just try to have an even and a fair application, shall we? According to multiple reports and video footage, a group of activists opposing ICE enforcement entered a church during a Sunday service. Hasn't even been a week today. They weren't there to worship. They weren't there to pray. They came to protest. The protesters, they entered the sanctuary, follow me, while the service was in progress. They unfurled banners. They shouted slogans, shouting and screaming. They disrupted the worship service. Some would describe it as they violently disrupted the worship service. Not throwing hands, but their behavior, the way they stormed in and shouted in worshipers' faces was physical at the very least and violent at the worst. They were disruptive. Witnesses reported that families with children were frightened. You can look online on X and pull up Nicki Minaj and the picture that she posted of the family cowering, protecting their child. Looks like they're covering the child's ears as they sat in complete shock and utter dismay. Families with children were frightened. Some congregants even left. The service was it was shut down in Minneapolis. Not in Inglewood, California, in Minneapolis. Among those present was the illustrious, multi-colored sweater-wearing Don Lemon, the former CNN anchor. Yeah, that's the one I'm talking about, who characterized his presence as journalism. You can just tell that I'm just thrilled about this topic and the people involved. I'm thrilled, aren't I? Disgusted is the better word, I think. Yeah, Don, fired Don, he was there filming, documenting the protest for what he described as a news story. Now, let's do a straightforward legal analysis using the elements of the FACE Act. First, intentional conduct. Did the protesters intentionally enter the church? Well, absolutely. This wasn't an accident. They planned it, organized it, coordinated their entry, and executed it. That's more premeditation than many of the abortion clinic cases that resulted in convictions. It was premeditated behavior. Second, force, threat of force, or physical obstruction. Did they physically obstruct the church service, Don? Yes, is the answer. They occupied the sanctuary. They prevented the normal progression of worship. They created an environment where worship could not continue. Now, if blocking a clinic door for minutes is obstruction, then occupying a sanctuary, Don, during a service is certainly considered obstruction under any objective reading of the dictionary. Third, interference with persons lawfully exercising their First Amendment right of religious freedom at a place of religious worship. Did congregants have their worship disrupted? Well, multiple witnesses confirm that the service couldn't continue, notwithstanding the video footage that we all have seen. The service couldn't continue, that people left frightened, and that the religious exercise was interrupted. That's the record. That's the record. Now, on the plain language of the statute, this appears to be a textbook violation. Using the exact standards these protesters demanded be applied to pro-life advocates. Now, I can anticipate their counter-arguments, of course, as a lawyer, and they're revealing. Some might say the protesters, they weren't trying to stop worship. They were trying to make a political point. But that's exactly what pro-life protesters say. They too were making a political point about abortion. And that argument didn't work for them. And it shouldn't work here either. Others might argue that the disruption was minimal or temporary. But duration isn't the standard. If you can't block an abortion clinic for 5 minutes like the person that I know did without facing federal prison, You can't storm a church sanctuary for any amount of time without facing the same consequences. I sure do hope that there's a whole lot of facial recognition software that has been applied to all those videos. Because those protesters/activists, whether paid or unpaid, all fall under this analysis. Now, some might claim First Amendment protection for the protest. But that's the same argument pro-life protesters make. And courts have repeatedly rejected it. The Supreme Court has held that your First Amendment rights do not give you the right to violate someone else's First Amendment rights. Let me repeat that for those in the ignorant section. The Supreme Court has held that your First Amendment rights do not give you the right to violate someone else's First Amendment rights. You can protest ICE policy. You can't do it by invading a church and stopping a worship service. News flash for you. The legal case is crystal clear in my view. And that's before we even get to old Don Lemon's role in all of this. Now, attorney Harmeet Dillon, someone else I know, a prominent civil rights lawyer, now within the DOJ, has publicly stated that she's exploring seeking an indictment against Don Lemon for his participation in this incident. And in my view, her argument has great merit, and I hope she pursues it. At least we might be able to escape him being inebriated on one New Year's Eve. That would be wonderful. Now, under federal law, specifically Title 18, Section 2 of the U.S. Code, whoever aids, abets, counsels, commands, induces, or procures the commission of a federal offense is punishable as a principle. Let that sink in. Don Lemon claims he was there as a journalist. But let's examine that claim for just a moment. If a journalist knows in advance that a federal crime is going to be committed, coordinates with the perpetrators, accompanies them to the scene, films the crime as it occurs, and doesn't report it to the authorities or attempt to stop it, at what point does that person cross from observer to accomplice? Don's lawyers need to probably look up the answer to that. Journalists do have broad protections when they're covering news events, even controversial ones like this. A reporter filming a protest that happens organically is protected. But if you're embedded with protesters who've planned to violate federal law, if you coordinate your presence with their illegal activity, if you facilitate that activity by your participation, you've crossed a line. The question isn't whether Don Lemon should get special treatment because he's a media figure, and questionably so. The question is whether he participated in a federal crime. And Dillon's exploration of that question is entirely appropriate. And if I've not been clear up to this point, other than what I see on New Year's Eve, my characterizations of what Mr. Lemon did that night are alleged. And this is a commentary on the news which is protected under fair use. There's that disclaimer. How do you like that? Now, whatever your opinion on ICE policy, And reasonable people can disagree about immigration enforcement. I wouldn't be one of those reasonable people because I believe you've got to enforce the law. And if you refuse to give ICE notice before you release illegal aliens from prison, then they end up in the streets of our cities. And there's collateral damage. People who are not criminals and child pedophiles and so forth, murderers, when you don't let them pick them up upon their release, then you get what you are seeing in the streets of America. It is not ICE's problem or fault that these sanctuary cities will not cooperate with ICE when they are releasing these criminals. No one says that loud enough, so I'll say it here. ICE does not have to be in the streets of our cities. They can be right at the jailhouse, pick them up, and take them on to where they belong. Let that sink in. These sanctuary policies and the leaders of these cities are they're creating this problem because they don't want anybody deported. They are pro-criminal. That is obvious. And we need to hold them to account for it and for the deaths that occur from the lady that was shot, Miss Good, to anybody from here on out. So whatever your opinion about ICE, that's not the issue for this episode. I can do that again, as I just did, but in maybe a little elongated fashion, I suppose. The issue is whether these protesters violated the very law they spent years demanding be used against others. And the answer on the face of the statute is yes, absolutely. So now, here's what's so galling about this situation. The sheer audacity of these protesters to believe they can demand one standard for others and a completely different standard for themselves. For years, they've argued that abortion clinic access is sacred, that even the slightest interference must be prosecuted, that creating fear or intimidation in people seeking abortion is a serious federal crime, deserving of prison time, is what they argue. But apparently, church access isn't sacred. Interfering with worship isn't sacred. It's just activism. Creating fear in families trying to exercise their religious freedom is just making a statement. They've built their entire legal and rhetorical framework on the principle that you cannot interfere with someone else exercising their constitutional rights, no matter how strongly you disagree with those rights. But that principle apparently evaporates when the rights being exercised are religious rather than reproductive. Think about the message they're sending. We will use the full force of federal law to protect abortion clinics, but we'll storm your churches whenever we feel like it. Sounds like something that would be happening in California, actually. We'll demand years in prison for people who block access to facilities we support, but will act outrage if anyone suggests we should face consequences for blocking access to facilities we don't. Make it make sense. You can't celebrate the FACE Act prosecutions for abortion clinic blockades and then act shocked when someone points out that you violated that same statute by storming a church. You can't demand that the law protect constitutional rights you agree with while ignoring it when it protects constitutional rights you don't. The law doesn't work that way, or at least it shouldn't. And here's the thing. Under the Trump administration, there's every reason to believe that religious freedom violations will be taken seriously. This isn't the previous administration that seemed to apply federal law based on political preference. This is an administration that has made religious liberty a priority, no matter what else you may not like about them. You can't dispute that. And people of faith should be able to applaud what they agree on. So, these protesters may find themselves facing exactly the standard they demanded be applied to pro-life advocates. I hope they do. They may discover that federal law means what it says, that it protects churches the same way it protects clinics, that disrupting worship is just as illegal as disrupting access to abortion services. And if that happens, they'll have no one to blame but themselves. They set the standard. They demanded aggressive prosecution. They argued for maximum sentences. They celebrated every conviction. They just never imagined the law would be applied to them. So let me be clear about something. This isn't ultimately about ICE policy. You can think immigration enforcement is too aggressive, like Joe Rogan, or not aggressive enough, like me. You can support comprehensive immigration reform or stronger border security or a path to citizenship. Those are legitimate policy debates. This is about a fundamental principle. You don't have the right to violate other people's constitutional rights to make your political point. Full stop. The FACE Act protects both reproductive health facilities and places of religious worship. It protects both because Congress recognized that Americans have fundamental rights that must be safeguarded from intimidation and interference, regardless of whether you agree with how those rights are being exercised. If you can storm a church to protest ICE, then by that logic, others can storm abortion clinics to protest abortion. If you can disrupt worship services to make a political statement, then by that logic, others can disrupt any facility or service they politically oppose. That's not a society of laws. That's a society of power, where whoever can mobilize the most disruptive force gets to violate everyone else's rights with impunity. These protesters don't want that society. They spent years arguing against it when it comes to abortion clinics. They've demanded that the law protect people exercising constitutional rights, even rights the protesters disagree with. They're right about that principle. They're just wrong to think it only applies when it's convenient for them. Here's what I want you to take away from this. The FACE Act says what it says. It protects places of religious worship the same way it protects reproductive health facilities. It prohibits interference with religious freedom the same way it prohibits interference with reproductive services. These protesters in Minneapolis appear to have violated that statute. Don Lemon may have aided and abetted that violation. And attorney Harmeet Dillon is right to explore seeking an indictment against him and everyone who was involved. Under an administration committed to protecting religious liberty, these violations may finally receive the same serious treatment that abortion clinic blockades have received in the past. That's not selective prosecution. That's equal application of the law. And if these protesters object to that, If they think it's unfair to apply to them the same standard they demanded be applied to others, then they need to answer one simple question. Make it make sense. This has been the Mark Little Show. I'm Mark Little. I am your host. Until next time, remember, you can't demand protection for rights you support while trampling on rights you don't. Law doesn't work that way. The law protects everyone, or it protects no one. God bless you. See you next time.